Everybody. This is the third lecture given that's sponsored by the Annisquam Historical Society this season, this summer, and this spring and summer. And this will be probably the last one of this year that we sponsor. David and Rita gave a first lecture, and then Sarah Clark on the church history, a second one, and this will be the third one given by our eminent historians here, David and Rita. And David is going to be talking about a wreck that happened 130 years ago of the Abbie P. Cranmer. And Rita will be talking about an artist captain who lived on River Road. I think you'll find it pretty interesting. And we'll also tell you much more about what goes on and what is available in the little building right next door, the firehouse. So David, thank you. Turn it over to you.
I'm going to be relatively quick because I know what follows is a little more complex than what I'm talking about. But I would like you to cast your minds back to this date, 130 years ago in 1888. 1888 was a bad year for weather in this part of the world. There was something called the Great White Hurricane in March of 1888, which killed hundreds and possibly thousands of people and destroyed infrastructure up the coast from Philadelphia up into the Maritimes and other parts, even into Ontario. So people might have been a little nervous. What happened on this date, 130 years ago, was just a standard coastal northeaster. And I put up Mr. Longfellow. I won't read it to you, but I will add one addendum, which is that it's disaster and daring in Ipswich Bay, and we have the addendum of some purple prose to go along with that. Now I want you to imagine me upstairs, dark and bleary, looking at the 1,453rd image to put through a scanner, and I pulled up a small 5x7 thin, color distorted by age print. And I thought, oh God, it's another picture that somebody took from the end of Cambridge Avenue over towards Coffin's Beach. But then I thought, wait a minute, what's going on in this picture? And that's what I'd like to tell you about. The thing that caught my eye was here. I think, Dave, I've given you a magnified view. Could I have the next one, please? Now go back one. Go back to this one first. What we have appears to be a rescue boat or a surf boat going the wrong way up the river. And out here on Coffin's Beach, we have a schooner. Out here, in serious trouble, we have a three-masted schooner. And we have a little unexplained, what Inspector Clouseau would say, a bimp out here on the rocks. So I'd like to take you through what I think all of these things represent and just mention that in the next slide, which is a cone on it, you can see the bald rocks. You can see the schooner way high and dry. You can see the bimp, and you might even talk yourself into seeing somebody standing next to the bimp. But look here at this schooner, which is in very serious trouble. And there is something in the shrouds that's not an artifact of the photograph. May I have the next one? It was a dark and stormy night, and the morning wasn't any better. 25th to 26th September, good-sized northeaster caught two schooners in Ipswich Bay. Three-master, which is the one you saw in serious trouble, tried to anchor under the lee of Bayview, which isn't much of a lee from a northeast storm, broke her chains and headed towards trouble. The other one, which you see high on the beach, was apparently a sand vessel. They took sand from Ipswich Bay to Boston to make glass. It was a big business. And she was lightly loaded. She ended up high on the beach, so much so that the crew could have simply hopped off the rail and been just fine. Not so much for the Cranmer. This is, found courtesy of my wife's unerring eye, an excerpt from the log of the lighthouse keeper of the Annisquam Light. And it says, approximately, September 26, strong northeast wind. I'm going to compress it a little bit. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, the schooner, the Hind, went high on the beach, and people could get off without assistance. At about 2:30, which is now 5.5 hours later, the three-master loaded with coal got stuck, and the crew and one lady were taken off by the Mass Humane Society's boat. And that will all become clear, I hope, in a minute. Dave? Abbie B. Cranmer is a pretty standard coasting schooner, and she picked up soft coal from Pennsylvania and was headed, I believe, for Portsmouth, New Hampshire, 120 feet long, sort of like the equivalent of a semi-tractor trailer going by your door today. And this is where they were. So this is a cone on that image. Here is this boat, and you can actually see the guy who's in charge standing up in the stern with his steering oar. The quality of you may not be able to see it from where you sit, but the quality of the image is sufficient so you can actually see the oar and the water. Here we have the unexplained bump. Here we have the bald rocks. And here we have the Cranmer, and you look at the size of the breakers. And the breakers were sweeping this boat from the stern to the bow. And what had happened was that the people on board, including the captain's wife of 1 year, had tried to take shelter in the main cabin, but it was being destroyed. So they climbed the rigging and lashed themselves to the rigging and either awaited rescue or death. And if those masts had gone over the side, we would have had our very own wreck of the Hesperus with real dead people. But I'll show you why that didn't happen. I did a little measuring here. There are bald rocks. This is the point at the end of Coffin's Beach, so people are oriented. I think she was probably about 500 yards out, and I'll tell you why I think that. Just looking at these rocks here, and there's another ledge further down the beach called Beach Ledge. If they had hit Beach Ledge, I wouldn't be talking to you because the schooner would have been minced on those rocks. They managed to thread the needle between bald rocks and Beach Ledge. Unfortunately, they threaded the needle at low tide. You remember the light schooner went up at high tide, and they hit 5.5 hours later at dead low, which is not the best possible timing if you wish to be rescued. Now, thanks to the magic of space and time travel, we have a news flash from our special correspondent from the Gloucester Daily Times. Do you have a word you'd like to share with us?
I would. The crew of the United States Life-Saving Station at Bayview had seen the vessel and, with commendable alacrity, had placed their mortar and lines on a 4-horse team and proceeded by land, a distance of 10 miles, to afford succor to those in peril. But in their zeal and haste, someone, whose duty it was to have looked out for such a mishap, did not provide sufficient powder, and there were only 4 charges. These were used with the greatest care. 2 failed to reach the vessel, and the line parted with the other 2. Here was indeed a sad state of affairs. The waves still continued to drench the poor creatures on the wreck, and their signals for help could be plainly seen. There was one hope yet, and that was the lifeboat at Annisquam. She was sent for, and also a supply of shells. If the time of her coming seemed long to those who were watching for the rescue of those on the wreck, how much longer it must have seemed to those poor creatures who could not know the cause of the delay and who were so weary with watching and waiting.
The important thing that the special correspondent said was that the life-saving service did not have an adequate number of charges, and I'll explain what we're talking about, to reach the wreck. Dave? That's next one. For those of you who don't remember or know, the U.S. Life-Saving Service was started in 1848. It merged in 1915 with the Revenue Service to form the U.S. Coast Guard. And the standing orders for the life-saving station commanders were, in the case of a wreck, they had to try all three methods of reaching the wreck. They could not sit down and say, we cannot do it. Hence the idea of you have to go out, but you don't have to come back, which, as many of you know, is now the unofficial motto of the U.S. Coast Guard. So let's see what the U.S. Life-Saving Service was and did, besides forgetting their powder charges. Dave? There was a life-saving station at Davis Neck, and this is the best picture we have. You can see the classic government standard house for the crew. Out on the point, there was a watchman's hut. And in the gap there, I think it looks to me like a stone sloop. It's a good-sized vessel. And they must have seen the Cranmer go right by their window as it was headed for the beach. So their choices of getting to the crew was either use the surf boat, and the surf boat lived on a wagon arrangement where you could detach one axle for launching. They put 4 horses on it and thundered through the nether regions of Annisquam, Riverdale, down the hill, got across the Cut Bridge somehow, and came up on the back of Coffin's Beach. The other options for the rescue service was, next slide, what was called the breeches buoy. And at the end of this, if anybody is confused, because I'm going to cover it quickly, this was a standard method of rescuing people from wrecks that was used up until the advent of effective helicopters, which means into the 1950s. And the trick is, here's the wreck, here's the crew, you fire a light line to the people in distress. They haul out a block system, which I will show you. You use that to set up a hawser, and people ride a little tram car arrangement from high in the rigging to high on the beach. And I think that little bump on the rocks they picked that area because it gave them some height. Otherwise, you're just going to drag people through the water if they're 500 or 600 yards away. I can't prove that. Next. This, I believe, to be the bump, the standard cart that the U.S. Life-Saving Service had, which everything they had in it to set up a complete rescue. And I won't bore you with it all, but these guys were trained to set up their system in under 5 minutes in the dark, and they rehearsed it every single week. It's a very impressive arrangement. Next. The Lyle gun, which they may have had, or they may have had a similar cannon, fired a projectile which weighed about 20 some odd pounds up to 700 yards, and it had a very light line on it. And the idea was they got that in the rigging of the vessel. The people climbed up in the rigging, hauled on this light line, and brought out. It's the best picture I can find. It's not what I would like, but you can see the Lyle gun, and that was their practice tower. Next one, Dave. So you pull on the light line, and out comes what was called the whip line. And some brave soul climbs up the mast, 2 turns and 2 half hitches. So my theory is for the rest of my life, if I want to know how to tie a line to a vertical post, it's going to be 2 turns and 2 half hitches, because they thought this one through. When this is on here, and you see this little tag, that tag is in English and French for other crews that don't speak English. You then haul out a reasonably heavy hawser and tie that with 2 turns and 2 half hitches, whereupon you ride the breeches buoy, which is a life ring with a pair of pants. like Bermuda shorts, where you stick your legs down in, and with any luck, they haul you to shore. That's what they were trying to set up. The Mass Humane Society, which at the end of that little speech that the special correspondent did, goes way, way, way back. It was set up in 1786. I think Paul Revere was part of it, or John Adams. There were 50 stations up and down the coast of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and their job was to help people who were wrecked. And they came well before the U.S. Life Saving Service, but in 1888, we had the Life Saving Station at Davis Neck, and we had the Humane Society boat right here, next to the lighthouse. And there is the very boat with the door open. Most of the time, people took pictures of the lighthouse, the door is closed. But this is the boat, undoubtedly, that took place in this rescue. Okay, now we know what's going on. Here comes the Mass Humane Society with a guy standing in the stern. They weren't going to go across the bar here, broadside to those breakers. So what do you think they did? They made an end run. And their idea was to get, and they could launch here and go out into the breakers and pick the people up from the schooner. And that's the rock, that's Bald Rock's breaking right there. As far as we can tell, they literally, with lots of volunteers, picked that boat up and carried it around the point to relaunch from Coffin's Beach. And I tried to figure out how much one of those things weighed and came up with some figure in the order of 1,500 to 2,000 pounds. But there were a lot of people, and I think you could probably say they were reasonably excited at the time. And when you're excited, you gain strength that you don't necessarily know that you have. And we have a news flash. Yes, ma'am.
It was indeed a thrilling scene presented at this time. The vessel groaning and bending with every wave that dashed against her, threatening destruction every minute to the anxious beings lashed to the rigging. The lifeboat and its gallant crew tossed about on the huge breakers like a feather, now buried out of sight, now rising high in the air, the crowd on the beach, anxious and excited. And the sun, which at this moment burst through the clouds like a beacon of hope, gilding the crested waves and forming a picture worthy the cunning of a Titian or a Raphael. Slowly and surely, the lifeboat reached its destination, but when, about halfway out, Mr. Frank E. Brown, who was acting as steersman, was thrown out, but was gallantly rescued by his comrades. At last, after several unsuccessful attempts to get alongside, the vessel was reached and the well-nigh exhausted occupants taken into the lifeboat amidst the cheers of the people on shore. And in 13 minutes from the time of starting, she struck the sand, where willing hands bore her high and dry on the beach. The lady, who was well-nigh exhausted, was taken in a carriage to Mr. Solomon Trumbull's house, where everything possible was done for her comfort, and she was soon on the way to recovery. The crew proceeded to Mr. Trumbull's cafe, where a hot supper awaited them, which was indeed most acceptable and partaken of with deep relish.
And ketchup.
Mr. and Mrs. Trumbull proved themselves true-hearted and sympathetic and are deserving of all praise for their praiseworthy efforts on behalf of the shipwrecked ones. Mrs. Mary passed a very comfortable night. Today, she is very stiff and sore, occasioned by her long clinging to the rigging. She will undoubtedly be well recovered in a day or two. Gloucester Daily Times, September 1881.
Mrs. Mary is Mary, the one-year wife of the captain of the Cranmer. Now, what in the hell are they talking about? Cafe, Trumbull? Here is the light vessel that everybody could just hop out, high and dry on Coffin's Beach. They could have leaned over the taffrail and ordered a double latte with shade-grown sustainable coffee and a whiff of chocolate across without even climbing off the boat. But look at this structure here. The guy who owned the land, including the beach, there's a pond in behind the beach. He had a house and a kind of a hotel there, but he built basically a fish fry bathroom, come have a drink, whatever you want to do. And when you see the pictures of people going to the end of Leonard Street in their bustles and their hats and being rowed across to Wingersheep Beach, I was wondering where the hell they're going. I mean, what, you're gonna go behind a sand dune? It turns out they're almost certainly going to Mr. Solomon Trumbull's Cafe. Dave. So I won't bore you with the whole thing, but this actually wasn't the wreck of the Hesperus because it turned out happily. Such was the wreck of the Hesperus in the midnight and the snow. Christ save us all from a death like this on the reef of Norman's Woe. Dave? This didn't happen. This happened somewhere else, but it didn't happen here. And why didn't it happen? It happened for this reason. This is from the records of the Mass Humane Society, and these are awards to the crew and helpers of the Mass Humane Society lifeboat. And they read like a litany of the people who lived in Annisquam at this time. We have Griffin, Parsons, Stanward, Ingersoll, Brown, Rowe, Davis, Stanwood, $10 each. And then Eben Davis, Oliver Ingersoll, remember that name? And Roscoe Ricker, who I believe had 13 children and lived down at the end of Leonard Street. He probably just wanted to get out of the house. Sidney Galt, Charles Jacket, they got $3. So they must have been instrumental in helping get the boat launched, carrying it around, and generally contributing. What happened to the Abbie B. Cranmer? Well, here she is in a calm day, not very long afterwards. She actually doesn't look all that bad in this image. However, if you have a picture on deck, her back is broken, all the structures on the deck have been ripped off, and you can see why the crew decided not to take refuge in the main cabin back here, because the main cabin is completely gone. Nobody said anything, but I get a feeling that there were a lot of houses in Annisquam that were kept warm by this coal through the upcoming year. And then the elements took care of the Cranmer, and my guess is that her bones are still out there on the other side of the bar. What happened to the Hine? Well, there she is in front of the cafe, and she looks very good. In fact, she was completely undamaged. The next one. We found a picture of her with an anchor chain out and her mainsail up, and I think they were probably waiting for an offshore wind and a good spring tide, and my guess is they just floated her free. So she was effectively completely undamaged. And this is Oliver Ingersoll, the guy who got $3, and his cat Mungo. And if you look carefully at Mungo, Mungo has been through the wars. So Oliver got $3. I don't know how much the cat got, but that was the wreck of the Abbie B. Cranmer, and the people of Annisquam really pulled this one off. I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't been available. So that is where I will cease, and we can leave Oliver up there.
My talk is the artistic captain of River Road. This was going to be a very brief talk on the prior occasion that we had a session, but from talking to folks like Tom Brooks, Peter Bent, and importantly, our guest speaker over to my left, Father David Michael, who you will hear from later, who's an important person in this story, this turned into a half-hour talk. So the artistic captain of River Road, next. So this is a story that started in the Annisquam Firehouse in May 2018, next. And Peter Lawrence came to help with the cleanup. And he started rolling up his sleeves and building shelves for us because downstairs there was a mess. Next, please. Next. In the closet underneath the stairs was a moldy environment for art, for photographs, and for posters. And we were trying to get them out of there into some better, safer storage to avoid more deterioration. Next, please. So Holly, who was the next person on the list here, was carrying up the paintings to the second floor where Peter had built the shelves, and I was trying to catalog them as we went. And then the next picture is of the painting that she's holding. And I am not a sailor. I get seasick.
At home.
At home, yes, right. On the porch. So I don't know the names of all of these boats, ships, or whatever they are. So the next picture is of this particular ship that we took out of the frame because I needed to know what it was. So I showed it to David, and he said, oh, it's a hermaphrodite, something or other, or brigantine, or something or other, words I can't spell. And so he said, though, well, who painted this? Because it's very good. Whoever did this knows his sailing. And if you look at the corner, next please, you can see a faint signature here. It says Spear. Now, because David has scanned all of these slides and Betsy's put them all on a spreadsheet so that we know what the slides are about, David recognized the name, and sure enough, he recognized the name well enough that he found the picture of the captain, which you saw on that first slide. Next, please. So this is Captain Thomas Spear. And Captain Spear is standing in front of his house. I'm not sure whether it shows up on the slide, but it says Snug Harbor, which is a typical name for captains in retirement to have their house called. And there's a big institution in New York that is called Snug Harbor that takes care of retired seamen. So here's, cats seem to have been the thing in Annisquam at that particular time. Next, please. We went to the census to find out exactly what was going on in terms of where he was. I think you can see here it says Curve Street, Thomas Spear, Deborah, who's his wife, Walter is his son, and then Newcomb Ida is the servant. And we go over here, and Thomas Spear is called caretaker. His son is a painter. The servant, we already knew, is Ida. Now, not knowing, of course, at the time that Captain Thomas Spear was the painter, we weren't sure whether it might be actually Walter. And we're coming from just one painting and one signature. Next, please. But 14 River Road, which you might recognize, is Tom Brooks' house. And I was telling this story to Rosalie, who was also working in the firehouse at the time, Rosalie Hughes, and she said, oh, I'll invite you over to our house for dinner, and you can talk to Tom about this. He knows something about the people who've lived in this house. So that was the first connection. And Tom, of course, had information related to the Bent family about Captain Spear. So this is an outsider coming in through a signature on a painting to find out that this is a much more complicated story than I ever realized. Next, please. And then David Teal went up the stairs in the firehouse, which he doesn't usually do, but he saw that, in fact, another painting on the stairwell by Captain Tom Spear, gift of Mr. Ross Lane, the senior Ross Lane, it was another painting that Spear had done. And in fact, there's another one right beside it, which is this one. So Captain Spear had left his tracks in the firehouse, but we hadn't really appreciated it. The other point I'll make, if anybody recognizes this building, we'd be most appreciative. This is obviously a different kind of ship than is going to be in Annisquam. It's got a, what do you call those things?
Leeboard.
Leeboard. Thanks, that's so helpful. Very shallow. This is obviously not Holland because there's rocks or a big promontory. This probably is a lighthouse, but maybe a church that's turned into a lighthouse. Not sure, but we can't find a picture of anything similar around the European coast. Next, please. So this is the North Sea, Baltic Sea. We think it's somewhere in here, but we can't tell you where. It just suggests, though, that this captain, who is said to have traveled quite long distance in his seagoing life was around this part of the world. So now we're back to the census, but there is a clue on this. If you look carefully, you'll also see that the census taker went to George Wainwright Harvey's house, and he's listed as artist. So Walter is probably a house painter, but why is Captain Spear listed as a caretaker? Now, this is courtesy of Peter Bent, and again, without the Bent family being involved in this talk, there wouldn't be much of a talk. This is the first photograph that I took an image of because the date is on it. It's 1911. But the next one, please, David, is a better photograph of Melbourne Hardwick holding the painting of Luther Bent and Captain Tom Spear, both in their old age. Now, I want to point out, next please, that this is called Tom's Workshop. It's a little room. The light is coming through the window, and you'll see the painting in a minute, but Melbourne Hardwick, very important, because if you turn to your left, there's his painting right there. So do you see what he's done? This is quite dark because there's no light on it, but there's light coming through a window on a lady, obviously Dutch, who's peeling potatoes. And he's used exactly the same Dutch format, if you will, in terms of the light and the shadow. Next, please. Now you can see the painting. And I don't know what we could turn down the lights, maybe not, but you can probably see this well enough. It's a gorgeous painting. It's very large. And here's Captain Spear, and he's actually making hand lines, which have heavy weights on them. And here's Luther Bent, who's watching what's going on. Captain Spear was not just a caretaker in the Bent household, he was a good friend. Here's a close-up picture that might show you the light a little bit. And through the window of this particular little house or shed, you can actually see the yacht club. Next. This is Luther Bent in his prime. Captain Spear is a sailor, a seaman, not well educated in any sense. Luther Bent, by this point, is a wealthy industrialist in the steel company. Very different kinds of people. This is his work shed. We think this is his workplace because if you put this little shed in line with the yacht club, it aligns perfectly. Now, this is a photograph. We don't know the date, and it's already been turned into a little chicken coop. There's a little ramp there for chickens. So this would be after Captain Spear died. But this would be where, let's see, whose houses? Pope's house now, yes. The Pope's are, this has now changed, dramatically since then, but this is where the Popes were, and here's the big Grandview Hotel on top. Next, please. Now, this is important, and this is why I think there was a close relationship with the captain and with Luther Bent. The enlistments in Boston in 1862, here is Tom Spear going to enlist in the Navy. He ends up being a quarter gunner in the American Civil War. Luther Bent enters the Army and fights gallantly in many battles. He really, when you read his history of what he went through in the Civil War, it's quite dramatic. He ends up being a major as he leaves his post. Next, please. And I think that the combination of this history, the Civil War history, was a particular bond. I can't prove that, and there may be family history that supports that. This is one of the paintings that Father David has in his possession, and it was the other clue as to why there was a close relationship with Luther and with Thomas. First of all, it's a little unusual. It's a steamship, all right? It's not a nice sailing ship with shrouds and sails, and it's sailing somewhere strange. This does not look like Boston. This looks like a strait in the sense that there's land over here and there's some fortification over here. I'll come back to this painting in a little bit, but David, you can move on a bit.
there is a document on the internet that you can find where Luther Bent, with his servant, Tom Spear, and this is now 1884. So that's his passport. Now, I found out that Americans actually didn't need passports. They actually could get them voluntarily, but in this era, they didn't need one. It wasn't a necessity. But for some reason, Luther Bent and Tom Spear had a passport, 1884. Next. And why were they traveling? They were going down to Cuba. Cuba, right. Now, I am not a good Spanish speaker. Uruguay, Iron Company. It's arugula. Yes, not arugula. This is where their travels took them on steamships. Next, please. There are documents that show, and I think you show the next, I think I circled it a bit, that Luther Bent, Felton Bent, and Tom Spear were on the SS Santiago going down to Cuba from New York and then returning to New York. And this is a tip of the hat because Eleanor and David figured this out. And they figured out that that ship was in fact the SS Santiago. It has a Spanish courtesy flag flying from its main mast. I'll show you at the very end. It has the stars and stripes on the back. The stripes on the funnel match, and it's the right era. So the Iron Company, which is in southeast Cuba and which was funneling iron ore, I had no idea Cuba had so much iron ore. Learned a lot from this talk. Iron ore going back to Pennsylvania for steel. This is the only town in Cuba that has a Bent name on it, and it's called Felton. And it was the port where the iron ore was taken from. So the Cuba Mail Line was really the New York and Cuba Mail Ship Company, was the Ward Line next. And they had lots of traffic going back and forward. Here is a photograph of the SS Santiago that Eleanor managed to find in the depths of the internet. Next. And this was where we think this particular painting might have been done in the Straits of Cienfuegos, although again, we don't have any proof of that. So coming back to the picture itself, this is the trip possibly that Captain Tom Spear took with Felton and Luther Bent, because Felton at that point was only 14 years old, and he may have been helping out as guardian or minder, if you will, while Luther Bent was doing his business. Here's the Spanish courtesy flag. I don't think you can see the stars and stripes. And the sad part about these paintings, they're watercolors, so they faded badly. Next, please. The other thing I wanted to note was that, of course, people move back and forward. Luther Bent was not here except in the summer. And it seems that Thomas Spear, who listed his address as Cohasset, when he was a contributor to the Ladies Sewing Circle in Annisquam in 1882. It's Sewing Circle, yes, right? I love this. Many a little makes a mickle, which is a Scottish word for makes a lot, a group of things. Anyway, so people who contributed, and here's Thomas and here's Deborah, we think this is somewhere around 1882 to 1884. Probably they were going back and forward to Cohasset at the time and staying in Annisquam in the summer while Tom Spear was working with Luther Bent. Next. The other point is, remember we talked about the quilt last session? Guess who else is on it? Tom Spear. So all of these little things all kind of add up. Next, please. One of the questions, if you look at that very early photograph I showed you, I mentioned that Thomas Spear was a gunner, Navy invalid, the signature on his pension paper by Elliot Rogers, one of my other heroes from Annisquam. I think he may have blown off his thumb. Now, I don't know whether that was a Civil War injury or whether that was related to another accident, because of course seamen can get accidents losing fingers all the time. But it was just interesting. I don't know whether he was a left-handed person or a right-handed person. it would be very interesting to see if there were any photographs in your collection where he's actually painting. Now, this is towards the end of, obviously, Captain Thomas Spear, for many years a resident of Annisquam, passed away very suddenly Thursday afternoon about 5:30 at his home, returning from the house of Major Luther S. Bent, which is in back, taken suddenly ill at the corner near the store of Charles Piper, who of course was also known as Peter Piper, and sat down on the doorstep. Mr. Piper noticed his condition and with the help of Bradbury Huff, assisted him to his home, where he passed away about half an hour later. He has been subject to attacks of heart trouble for some time. This is in 1913. Now, his death certificate is signed by the person who seemed to sign every death certificate around this part of the world at that time, Dr. Rowley. Rowley, that's right. I never get it right. So where is it? Rowley. Valvular heart disease. Now, valvular heart disease is usually associated with streptococcal disease of the, and post-streptococcal problems and rheumatic heart fever. And it's possible that the doctor had enough good clinical sense to be able to use a stethoscope, which people don't seem to know how to do anymore, and actually hear the murmurs, because that's classic kind of murmurs that you will hear with valvular heart disease from rheumatic fever. So he may have had cardiac insufficiency and a heart attack related to prior illness, which he may have acquired during the Civil War. Next, please. And Luther Bent died 2 years later at 85 years of age. Next. Mount Adna Cemetery is where Captain Spear and his wife are buried. And the next picture will show you in the corner, there was this little stone in the same plot. And I thought, gee, that's funny. And next picture is a little better view of it because the lichen is getting tough to read the names. But it's Guy Sanborn and Louisa. When we go back again to Captain Spear's history, his son Walter had a daughter, Louisa. Louisa married Guy Sanborn. Right down here, the marriage certificate. So we followed that train down that rabbit hole. Next. And we find out that Richard Sanborn, who would be a great-great-grandson, had an obituary in the newspaper, and it listed his brother, who was a twin, Thomas C. Sanborn. Thomas, I was hoping he could be here tonight, but he lost his wife a couple months ago. He lives in Kingston, New Hampshire, and I've talked to him on the phone, and he had no idea of his great-great-grandfather's history. So he's going to be very pleased to have known that that story has been told. Next, please. Now, the important person who's going to talk is Father David Michael over here, because it was Tom Brooks who sent me David Michael's story that started this whole business going on, because he had in River Road the story of housekeeper for a captain, Thomas T. Spear, and my great-grandmother.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm David Michael. I'm actually a native of Gloucester. I was born at the little community hospital down the street here, raised in Magnolia, and my paternal grandparents owned a house over in Magnolia. When my father died when I was a teenager, we then moved in with my maternal grandparents, the Barnards, Marion Barnard, George Barnard, who built a house over on Blindman Avenue. And while I was living there with my grandmother for a number of years, I was a teenager, my grandmother would often refer to old Captain Spear. And you know, when you're a teenage boy and your grandparents can be garrulous sometimes and will make these references and you sort of brush them off. But I remember in the conversation over the years, she would say, well, when I lived down on Leonard Street with old Captain Spear, and she pointed out these, we were going to show these paintings? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what order they were. Oh, there it is. That's the most important one there, yeah. This is my grandmother, Marion Newcomb, who became Marion Barnard. Because of the stories that she had, or these allusions that she had made to her time living in the house of old Captain Spear, During one winter some years ago, for want of something to do, I began to look into my family history. And so I come at this Thomas Spear from a very personal point of view. And I knew that my great-grandmother, Marion's mother, Ida Newcomb, had been the housekeeper for Captain Spear. That much I knew. I also knew of Captain Spear having left, or I assume left in his will. He certainly gave to my grandmother a couple of lovely little miniatures, which I now own. And we can show them here, and you can see that there's really a high degree of artistry, I think. I'm not an artist myself, but I have a total of 5 of these little miniatures. You saw the one of what we now believe to be this vessel out of Cuba. Here is the Frolic, Dutch galleot of the Baltic, and you can see the signature spear. Unknown vessel, but isn't it a beauty? And my favorite, Niobe, really lovely. I remember reading Joe Garland's book about Fitzhenry Lane, that Lane was so accurate with his depictions of vessels that you could rig a vessel from one of his paintings. And one gets the impression here, as David has also affirmed, this was a man who knew his boats. So I began to look into the story of this Captain Spear, who he was. I had no references. And I knew that my grandmother lived with him when she was in her high school years. So I began to use that. That was 1900 to 1904. And I went to the library and began to look through the city directories. That's how I first located the name Spear. And he became something that was actually a historical rather than just an anecdotal reality for me. So I began to work that way with finding my own information. A lot of the information that Rita also discovered, so she comes at it from a different point of view. We've now put together, I think we have a pretty good biography of the man. And I am delighted to be here tonight because when I had done this work, it was really for my own interest. And I have a sister who lives over in Manchester and her interest, but really had no way to pass this on to another generation of people who would be interested in this. I had come down here to meet Tom O'Keefe some years ago. Tom brought me over to Peter's house, who showed me that wonderful painting. He also loaned me a couple of his black and white photos of Captain Spear, so I actually got to see the man. But at the point, just derailed my train of thought, I guess. At any rate, I determined that my great-grandmother, Ida Newcomb, was in Cohasset when her husband died. There is obviously a connection with Captain Spear and Cohasset as well. So I think it is reasonable to assume that Captain Spear knew my great-grandmother Ida from his Cohasset connections. My great-grandfather, Robert Newcomb, Ida's husband, died as a result of striking his head, according to my grandmother, on a boat. And this, again, is part of this anecdotal inheritance. And she said that he died of creeping paralysis. Well, I did some research on my great-grandfather. In fact, found his death certificate. He died of cerebral hemorrhage. But I think she was correct in her assessment. Whether this was an accident that took place when he was working in the boatyards as a painter in Boston, and then moved to Cohasset in his infirm years, or whether this was an accident that happened at his brother-in-law, Nathaniel Treat's boatyard in Cohasset, we don't know. But that brings the family, the Newcomb family, from Maine to Cohasset. Robert died there in Cohasset, a relatively young man in his 40s. That left my great-grandmother Ida a widow. Shortly after that, Deborah, the wife of Captain Spear, died. And I think it makes sense to me, at least, I'm connecting dots here, but it makes sense to me that at that time, Captain Spear would have invited my great-grandmother Ida, the widow, to come to his house as his housekeeper, the widower. And of course, my great-grandmother brought my grandmother, Marion Newcomb. I think Marion probably lived with Captain, as I say, for her high school years, 1900 to 1904. And she married my grandfather, George Barnard, I think around 1906. I have to double check the date. So for about 5 or 6 years or so, she lived here. My great-grandmother continued to live here in Annisquam, eventually removed back to her native Maine, where she passed away somewhere in the early 1930s. I forget the exact date. So that was my own family story, and allowed me to learn a lot about this man whom I felt ought to be remembered. And that's why I'm especially gratified that Rita should have contacted me about the work that she had done, and we're able to bring at least these two pieces together. He's a man who obviously made a great contribution here in this village, who was a lovely artist, and I think he ought to be recognized for that. I'm very pleased that we've sort of brought him to life through our work and through our presentation. So I also have brought a couple of little mementos here. I have my great-grandmother kept a little diary in the Prudential Insurance Company of America date book from 1905. She got this from August Peterson, who I think was a nephew of my grandmother, of my great-grandmother's in Cohasset. But she makes reference in this little diary that she kept while she was here. For example, Alice and Marion went to Valley Farm, which we assume was some type of a presentation or play or something like that, at the Village Hall, bought tickets. That's here. Yeah. Apparently, a couple of days later, my great-grandmother herself came to Valley Farm here. Walter and I, now that would have been Walter, the son of Captain Spear, went to a reading room. Oh no, that's a different, yeah, here it is. February 13th. Walter and I went to Valley Farm at Village Hall. Walter tickets. I assume he treated her. So you see these lovely little pieces that bring someone to life, someone who ought to be remembered. And finally, my grandmother's yearbook from 1904, from Gloucester High School, 1904. I think it was probably rather an achievement for a young woman in 1904 to graduate from high school. And she was very proud of the fact that she served on the editorial board of the Gloucester High School yearbook that year. She kept her yearbook. So here I have this wonderful memento. This, of course, would have been at the same time that she was living here in Annisquam. So both of my grandparents, Marion and George, moved over to, as I say, the house they built on Blimmen Avenue. They died here in Gloucester. So that's about all I have to say. If there are any questions. Have we shown all of the paintings? This is it, right? Yeah, okay.